For so long, I had saw myself as deadly. I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't even get him the gun. But for so many years, I felt that I had killed him. Losing someone to suicide has this way of playing with our minds, of convincing us of things that are actually not even based in reality. We know that suicide is a taboo topic, that the mere mention of it is enough to create awkwardness, anxiety, and even silence. And to be honest with you, as the date of this talk approached, I found myself suddenly asking the question, why in the world did I ever agree to do this? That the thing I had been so confident about suddenly became the reason that I wasn't sleeping at night. The idea of being up here and speaking to something so personal and so deeply painful began to feel like the biggest mistake. You know, as a psychologist, I'm intimately connected to the topic of suicide through therapy practice, research, and even trainings that I conduct. And one of the things that I've recognized is that we need to be able to break this silence that exists around this. And this is what I want to do today, is I want to be able to start the conversation and to break that silence. Because what we know is that every year suicide rates are on the rise. In the United States alone, last year, 47,000 people died by suicide. What we know is that every 11 minutes, a new suicide is completed, and which unfortunately means that by the time I finish this talk today, we will have lost another person. So if we can break that silence, again, we can start the dialogue and we can start the conversation with each other. What I want to acknowledge today is the fact that I can imagine there are a lot of people actually in this room that are part of the community of those left behind by those who have died by suicide. And the reality is that if you're not, someday you might actually be. I remember actually when I was in graduate school, I had someone actually tell me there are two types of therapists: those who have lost a client to suicide and those who will. So what I want to do today is I want to share my personal story of losing a client to suicide, and I want to explore the two primary lessons that I learned in navigating this trauma. And so my relationship with my client actually started off pretty rocky. In our first hour-long appointment, he spoke a total of 5 words. 1 hour, 5 words. Seriously, I counted. There was nothing else to do. He challenged me on every level to have to learn, how do you develop a relationship with someone who has worked through and tried to process his own trauma for so many years that he has pushed everyone away just to keep himself safe? As the months and months went on, our relationship grew, and so did his trust in me. He started opening up more. In particular, I remember that he talked a lot about this book he was writing, and even brought chapters of the book into our sessions to be able to share with me. This book was about his healing journey through his own trauma, and his hope was that one day he would get it published and be able to share it with others to help them feel less alone. And today in particular, the really interesting thing to me is he would often talk about this dream that he had of one day being up on a stage in front of an audience, speaking truth to the trauma that he went through, again with the hope that he would help others find their healing journey and be able to feel less alone. So the irony of me being up here today doesn't escape me. So 9 years ago, almost about a year into our relationship and into our work with each other, he decided to end his life 12 hours before our next appointment. 12 hours. I can't even begin to tell you how long that this number has haunted me. The questions that started to come. Why couldn't he have just held on a little bit longer? Didn't he know that we had an appointment and we could have tried to make it better? And then there was the most painful one. What did I miss? The first lesson that I learned in navigating this tragedy was that time and time again, we will choose pain over losing control. So often when someone dies by suicide, we put all the blame on ourselves. You see, for me, it was easier to accept the blame and responsibility than it was to accept the reality that suicide is made up of so many different factors and isn't attributable to just one thing, or in my case, one person. The pain of blaming myself almost became addictive, as if it was a form of punishment that I was using to inflict upon myself to make up for something that I felt that I had done. To me, it was easier to replay that last moment with him in my head over and over again, searching for something that I missed before I would pass out from sheer emotional and mental exhaustion, than it was to accept the reality that suicide is this complex entity. Because if I accepted that reality, by default, I would have to accept the fact that it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing that I could have done to stop him. And that meant that I wasn't in control. And for anyone who knows me, you know how much I love control. I crave it in my life. If I could find the way to control, I totally would. Because what I realize is that if I'm not in control, there is no way that I can ever prevent this from happening again. And that, to my core, was my deepest fear. How do we even begin to confront the reality that if someone really wants to die, there is nothing that we can do to stop them? You know, in my field as psychologists, we often joke that we have this slight narcissistic tendency, some of us not so slight, where we think that we can save people. And honestly, it's probably part of the reason a lot of us get into this field is because we really feel like we can make a difference and an impact. But for me, what it meant is I had to start to let go of this illusion that I was more powerful than I actually was, that I needed to start to see myself not as superhuman, but as human. So what I learned from this is that holding on to control, despite whatever amount of pain that we have to endure, is actually the thing that keeps us stuck in our healing. I mean, how can you ever expect a wound to heal, right? If you just keep reopening it over and over and over again. What I learned is that actually letting go of control, despite how hard it is, can be one of the most freeing things that we can ever experience. And it can actually signify the start of our healing process. The second lesson that I learned in navigating through this tragedy is that shame is one of the loneliest places a person can ever be. Soon after his death, what I found is that people started to distance themselves from me. They started to tiptoe around me, felt like they saw me as differently, and even at times it almost felt like they were treating me as fragile, like they were waiting for me to break. A lot of times when we need people the most, they avoid us. And it's not that they don't care, it's just that none of us ever really know what to do or what to say to console someone who has lost a person, especially if that loss has been to suicide. And if people distancing from us isn't enough, there's this thing, right, called shame, that quickly becomes this unwelcome visitor in our lives. For me, it felt like I wasn't like other psychologists, and that people could tell this just by looking at me. That somehow his death had left this permanent stain on me that was visible to anyone who dared to even really look. I remember interviewing for my job actually here at the university about 4 months after he died. And toward the interview day, I got asked a question. So tell us something that we wouldn't know by just looking at you. I froze. Is this a trick? Could they see this stain that's all over me, even though I've worked so hard to be able to mask it? I couldn't tell you how I actually answered the question that day, but what I can tell you is that I did not tell them about this. I wasn't ready at that time to break my silence because I feared that if they knew this about me, I would be seen as deadly in their eyes. You know, so often we create these things in our head, these pieces of shame that grow and grow and grow. Brené Brown, who many of you probably know, talks about if you actually put shame in a petri dish and you add 3 ingredients, silence, secrecy, and judgment, it grows exponentially. And that's what happened to me as mine grew. It felt like every person who was looking at me saw me as having something wrong with her. And the fact that people were avoiding me just served to reinforce this, that there was something wrong with me and that I, in fact, would never, ever be right again. What I learned through this process was just how much pain suffering alone can create. If I could somehow have my 28-year-old self right in front of me today, right now, I would want her to know there is nothing wrong with her and that she doesn't have to suffer alone in her grief. I want all of us to know that there is a community of people who have lost folks to suicide, and there are resources to be able to access them. There's even this day called International Survivors of Suicide Day that takes place every November and honors those left behind by suicide deaths. I can't be the person to stand here today and to tell you that after 9 years, I'm completely healed. The reality is that I'm not. I still have my harder moments, and honestly, I don't actually fully believe that someone ever completely heals from a tragedy like this. It's impossible to return to the old version of ourselves when you go through this type of trauma. But what we can do is we can put our energy toward healing, and we can put our energy toward creating the life that we're going to have after this tragedy occurs. So coming up with the ending of this talk was actually the hardest part for me. To try and end a story that had an all too tragic and all too sudden ending just on some level felt wrong. I can't tie it up all nice and neat with a bow. Again, it's just not the reality of it. But at the same time, what I can do is share a couple of things with you. I can share that what I know now is I'm working hard to let go of the need to be able to control the decisions that my clients and others in my life make. What I know now is that I have no stain, and there is nothing wrong with me as a person or as a psychologist. I'm actually pretty amazing. And most importantly, what I know now is that I didn't kill him. The book that he actually wrote sits on my bookshelf in my office, still unfinished. It reminds me that my healing process is also unfinished. And in some way, it feels like it keeps me connected to him and connected to all of us who have gone through this type of pain. I now know that I'm not alone, that none of us are alone. Thank you.